Tractate Berachot is the first book of the Talmud, or the Gemara as it's called, a massive 40-book-long series written over 2,000 years ago, which basically discusses and to some extent codifies all of Jewish law. Each book deals with some topic of Jewish practice and are essentially some of the most important and fundamental books in all of Judaism. The first book of which, being this one, Tractate Berachot, deals with primarily the laws of prayer and blessings, although due to the formatting of this book and basically all of the books of the Talmud, it gets sidetracked very often and quickly descends into conversation about personal anecdotes, historical figures, medicine, angels, demons, life advice, or just general miscellaneous things which are totally off topic. Specifically, the formatting is that there's a much older text called the Mishnah, which is somewhat vague and undefined in all of its laws, so there's like 100 or so rabbinical sages in a room wherein a portion of the Mishnah is quoted, and they all spend the next few pages discussing it, trying to figure out which opinions are correct, what's what, all of which is then written down. So there's a lot of information. It jumps around very often into whatever subject someone feels is relevant to bring up. So that's just something to bear in mind. I mean, this video is almost an hour long and it's just chapter 1 of book 1, which is actually a super compact summary going by what's generally out there. In fact, I go through this pretty fast, doing my best to explain it properly, but if you feel something needed more explanation, please leave a comment and I can try and help explain whatever portion you need to you, or if you can, just open the text yourself. There are tons of fantastic English translations online nowadays. And with that intro out of the way, let's get straight into it. Tractate Berachot opens by quoting the Mishnah in regards to the designated times of saying the evening Shema prayer, one of the most fundamental prayers in all of Judaism. There are several opinions as to the times that this prayer is said. Rabbi Eliezer says from the time that the priests serving in the temple would eat of their truma, which was a special designated holy food, until the end of the first watch, which will be defined later. Opinion 2 is the rabbis, who say it's until midnight, and the last opinion is Rabban Gamliel, who says you have until dawn. This is seen in a story where his sons came back really late from a wedding hall, and he told them that they could still say Shema as it wasn't yet dawn. In fact, Rabban Gamliel holds that, as the rabbis said you have until midnight, they actually always mean until dawn by all instances, even with temple sacrifices which had limited times, and they only said until midnight to be safe, and not have people wait until the last second for things. And that's the end of the Mishnah. Now to the Gemara discussing this piece. First of all, 2 questions. What's our source for saying a Shema prayer in the evening at all? And why are we discussing the evening one first? Why not the morning Shema first? 2 answers are offered, both citing verses from the Torah in regards to the Shema. It says, when you lie down and when you get up. And by the creation of the world, it says the verse, and there was evening and there was morning, implying 1, that Shema is said in the evening, as it says when you lie down, and 2, based on the order in the verses, the evening one is discussed first. And in fact, the day in the Hebrew calendar actually starts by night because of all this. Question: but later on, when the blessings of the Shema are discussed, it mentions the morning Shema first, not the evening one. Answer is, after we've discussed and established that evening goes first, we can revert to using morning first later on. Okay, question. That first opinion, Rabbi Eliezer, said that the time starts by the priests eating their teruma. When exactly is that? It's when the stars come out. So why didn't they just say that? Because he wanted to also establish that the time that the priests eat their teruma is actually at this time of the stars going out. Okay, we're going to get a bit sidetracked now and discuss priests and their teruma food. Basically, in the times of the temple, the priests would eat their special holy teruma food, but they had to be pure in order to do so, which had a number of rituals in order to become purified in such a manner. They had to wash themselves, they had to bring an atonement offering, and they had to wait for the day to end. The verse states, and the sun sets, and it is purified, in regards to them eating their teruma. Implication is that to be able to eat their teruma, they just need to wait for the day to end, and it's not necessary to immediately bring the atonement offering. Okay, but what about that and it is purified part? Doesn't that imply he needs to do the water immersion step too? Well, no, because it doesn't say and he is purified, it says and it is purified, which implies not him being pure, but the sky being pure, meaning day ending. This makes a bit more sense in Hebrew, but yeah, you get the idea. Then it also says that elsewhere the same question was brought up and they reached the same conclusion. Okay, New point, back to in regards to the set times for Shema. We said an opinion of from the time that the priests eat their teruma until the end of the first watch. However, there's a contradictory opinion, which states that the times are from when a poor person eats his supper until when he ends his meal. So, the second part about the ending time definitely contradicts each other, because there's no way you finish supper by the time of the first watch. So, clearly these are two different times. However, the beginning time, when a poor person eats his supper, could very well be the same time as the priests eating their teruma, so that point is not a contradiction. However, we can cite a different source where there's an argument between a Rabbi Meir and the rabbis about this exact topic, one saying the time is when the priests eat teruma, and the other being when the poor eat their bread. The fact that these two opinions are pitted against each other can only mean that they actually are two separate times, and that's the conclusion. In fact, it lists another example of this elsewhere where a ton of opinions when you say Shema are listed, and both of these are mentioned separately, again further proving that they are separate times, which is our final answer. And as they've been established to be different times, we can also say that the poor person's separate time is actually the later one, as if it was the earlier of the two, then that guy's opinion would actually end up being the same as someone else's. In fact, just to get sidetracked a bit further, one of the opinions mentioned in that big list of quoted times was of Rabbi Meir, who says that the time of the evening Shema starts by the time that the priests immerse themselves. Question, but the priests immerse themselves by day, and this is the evening Shema. How could that be the starting time? So he answers that he has a bit of a different opinion as to when night starts. Unlike them, he holds that twilight, bein hashmashos, as it's called, isn't a period of time of the day, it's just a dividing line, meaning there's the morning before twilight and the night after, but there's no actual time period of twilight. So the priests could immerse right before this line, right as it's getting dark, so it's technically morning, but it's late enough to be able to say the evening Shema. Okay, question. If you've been paying attention, we said one opinion of Rabbi Meir was that the time is of the priests eating teruma, and later we quote Rabbi Meir saying the time is when the priests immerse. So is he contradicting himself? Answer is no. These two opinions were said by two different people, quoting Rabbi Meir, each with their own version as to what he said. In fact, there's a similar contradiction with the opinions of Rabbi Eliezer, and the same answer is given. Or you could say that Rabbi Eliezer said both, but only part of the first opinion, the part which doesn't contradict. Okay, back to the main point. Rabbi Eliezer said the times are from when the Kohanim eat teruma, which we spent quite a while trying to figure out, and then he says until the end of the first watch. So, when exactly is that? Well, he holds there are 3 watches, making each watch 4 hours. And he said until the end of the watch, instead of just saying until 4 hours, because he wanted to represent that the same way there are watches, there are corresponding watches up in heaven. He also establishes ways of knowing when each watch begins and ends, things like when babies wake up to nurse, when certain animals are awake, making noise, etc., each of which corresponds to the end of the first watch, the middle of the middle, and the beginning of the last watch. Or possibly the end of the last watch, and he establishes a sign instead of just, looking outside and seeing if it's morning, in case you're in a dark house. Rav Yitzchak Bar Shmuel pops in here to agree that the night has 3 watches, and in each of them, God mourns the destruction of the temple and the exile of the Jewish people. Story time. Rabbi Yossi interjects to tell us a somewhat relevant story, where he was walking along and popped into some ruins to pray. So, Eliyahu the prophet showed up, and when he finished praying, informed that he probably shouldn't enter ruins to pray. And if you were worried about someone interrupting you, you could have just prayed an abridged prayer, which establishes that you shouldn't enter a ruin, you may pray on the road, and if you do an abridged version. Then Rabbi Yossi informs Eliyahu that while he was praying, he heard a voice from heaven mourning the destruction of the temple and the exiling of the Jewish people, and Eliyahu says, yeah, that also happens all night, and when people say the Kaddish prayer, God considers himself fortunate and mourns his exiling of the Jewish people. Okay, that's the end of the story, but we're going to get hung up on it a little bit and say 3 reasons not to enter ruins. 1, because people might think that you're up to no good. 2, because it might collapse on you. And 3, there might be demons. We need all 3 of these reasons to establish that this is unacceptable even if you go in with 2 people, which would prevent demons, if the structure is stable, which would prevent collapse, or if the 2 people are of good moral character, which would prevent suspect of doing something wrong, or with any combination of 2 of any of these. You'll always end up needing all 3. And even by demons, 2 people being there isn't always a guarantee of safety. Additionally, we could need the demon answer in case it's a new structure in an open field where there's no concern of getting up to no good. Alright, that's that for now. Now, back to the watches. The source for there being 3 watches by night is from a Rabbi Nassan, who quotes the book of Judges. Gideon and the 300 men with him came to the edge of the camp at the beginning of the middle watch. Middle watch implies a first watch and a last watch, so therefore 3 watches. There's a different opinion, Rebbe, who says there are 4 watches, and he interprets this as saying that there are actually 2 middle watches. His actual source for there being 4 watches is that it says by King David that he woke at midnight and that his eyes preceded the watches. Watches is plural, implying he got up before a minimum of 2, and it's after midnight, which has 2 watches, totaling 4. Rabbi Natan's view of this verse is based on the fact that it's established that kings wake up a little bit later, so his total sleep amount would only be for 3 watches. In addition, you could say that 1.5 watches is referred to as 1 watch, which further works to reconcile those verses. On a totally unrelated note, this just being tossed in here because we're quoting teachings by a specific person, and this is one of them. You don't discuss Torah-related matters before the dead, as it could be seen as mocking them. Some even say you shouldn't discuss anything at all before them that's not strictly related to the dead. Okay, back to King David's sleep schedule. It says that he woke up at midnight, but elsewhere it says that he got up by the evening, so a few answers are suggested. Firstly, he usually got up by the evening, but always made sure to be up by midnight. Secondly, he would sleep like a horse until midnight, meaning in very brief 30-second intervals, and at midnight he would get up fully. There's a bit of discussion here if the Hebrew word neshef means evening in this context. Conclusion is yes, it does. It's just that it could refer to both dawn and nightfall. In fact, in regards to midnight, it says that Moshe, when he was informing Pharaoh about the 10th plague of the death of the firstborn, he said that he would go out at about midnight. So, what's going on there? Did Moshe not have an exact time? Why'd he say about? And if so, how was David able to know exactly when midnight was if Moshe wasn't? So it's answered that David hung his harp by the window, and at exactly midnight a wind would blow playing the harp, and this would wake him up, at which point he would spend the rest of the night in prayer and song, and then the entire day dealing with court-related stuff with Achitophel, his war counselor, Benaiah ben Yehoiada, as the head of the Sanhedrin, the High Court, who were consulted before any military decisions were made. The point about the harp waking him up is based on a verse in Tehillim where it references this. As for how Moshe and David knew what time to get up, there's an answer that both of them knew precisely what time midnight was. It's just David needed the harp to wake him up, and Moshe said about in case the Pharaoh's astrologers got their calculation wrong and called him a liar. From this we learn to accustom ourselves to say, I don't know, so you don't get yourself in trouble. A final answer is given, which is that of a different translation. The way it's spelled could either be about midnight, or it could mean like this midnight, meaning tomorrow at the same time as right now, which would explain Moshe's sentence. Okay, some more on King David. Famously, he says in Tehillim that I am pious, and it's explained that he says this as 1, he wakes up early at midnight to pray, and 2, unlike other kings, he was hands-on in dealing with physical cases of law, often which got his hands pretty dirty, literally handling blood and whatnot. Also, he would always consult his teacher, Mephibosheth, before making a ruling without feeling embarrassed. In fact, Mephibosheth's name was actually Ishbosheth, but he was called Mephibosheth because it's similar to the word mevayish, which means to embarrass, which references this idea. And because of David's humility in this regard, Kilov, a very wise man, was descended from David. In fact, by him, too, his name was actually Daniel, but he was called Kilov as he would embarrass, which is similar to the word machilim, similar to his name, Mephibosheth, with his wisdom in a good way. Okay, we know David called himself pious, but it's taught elsewhere that David questioned whether he was worthy of having a portion in the world to come, so why would he call himself pious in this case? So, that's only because he was afraid in case he might sin and become unworthy. A similar thing happened by the forefather Yaakov, where he was afraid of being unworthy of God's protection in case he sinned. That actually had happened in the time of the prophet Ezra, as the Jews entered Israel after the Babylonian exile, based on a juxtaposition there to a verse by Yeshua bringing the Jews into Israel. That by Ezra, it would have been in a miraculous manner similar to Yeshua, but due to the Jewish people's sins of that time, they were not worthy. Okay, back to Shema times. The rabbi's opinion was until midnight. This is established to mean that they actually hold like the last opinion, Rabban Gamliel, which is until dawn, but they're just saying it's earlier to be safe in case you think you'll try and catch a little sleep before you say the prayer and accidentally sleep past the deadline. It also adds that if you violate this particular rabbinic stringency, you're liable for the death penalty. This is said to either discourage people who are super sleepy or to establish that the evening Shema prayer is mandatory fully. There's actually an argument as to the Shema prayer. Rabbi Yochanan says you say the evening Shema and then the rest of the prayer, and Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi says you say the prayer and then the evening Shema. The source of this disagreement is either logical, that Rabbi Yochanan holds that as the Jewish people were freed from Egypt also by night, we want to have the Shema prayer and its blessings, which cite this event juxtaposed to the evening prayer. According to Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi, the main redemption event happened in the morning, hence his opinion that it said by the morning. Alternatively, the argument is based on a verse, when you lie down and when you get up. Rabbi Yochanan says the same way. By the morning prayer, when you get up, has Shema said first, and then the rest of prayers, so too by evening Shema and prayers when you lie down. Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi would interpret this that you say Shema closer to when you get up, meaning first thing, and closer to when you lie down in bed, meaning after prayer. There's an additional point that there are some blessings said in between Shema and the rest of prayers, but they don't count as an interruption or separation between the two. It's just an extension of the Shema portion. There's a similar point to a short prayer said before the actual prayer, which doesn't act as an interruption, as it also serves as an extension of the prayers. Side point, if you say the 145th Tehillim 3 times a day, you're guaranteed a spot in the world to come. Specifically this one, as the prayer is alphabetical and speaks about God sustaining everything on earth. It actually isn't totally alphabetical, it lacks a verse starting with the Hebrew letter Nun, as that references a verse speaking about the downfall of Israel, which starts with this letter, hence its exclusion. In fact, the next verse in the Tehillim references this. The following letter speaks of God supporting the fallen Jews. Side point, the angel of Michael is greater than the angel Gavriel, as Michael is referenced being able to make journeys in a single flight, unlike Gavriel, who requires 2 based on some verses. Elio the prophet takes 4 flights, and the angel of death takes 8, but during a plague, only 1. Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi also says that in addition to the Shema by the evening prayer, say Shema in bed. Rabbi Nachman says you don't need to do this if you're a Torah scholar, since you'll probably be involved with Torah as you fall asleep anyways, but Abaya says you still do. On this note, Reish Lakish says you should always have your good inclination fight against your bad one, and if you can't, you should learn Torah. And if that doesn't work, say the Shema prayer, and if that one doesn't work, remind yourself that you'll die one day. The rabbi also explains how every single facet of Torah was given at Mount Sinai, each word of a verse referencing a different aspect. Rabbi Yitzchak says that saying Shema by bed is akin to holding a double-bladed sword by night, guarding you against anything not good, particularly demons. Reish Lakish says learning Torah keeps you safe from suffering, which will occur particularly if you're able to learn Torah and still don't, and this is something that even kids know. On this point, it's said that God is unlike mortals, as mortals give up their beloved objects and then mourn, but God gave up his Torah to the Jewish people, his beloved things, and was happy. Anyways, if you're suffering in any way, you should examine your actions, and if you can't find anything, assume you need to learn some more Torah, and if you're still having a rough time, assume it's done for whatever God's reason is, and know that it's done out of love, and you should accept it knowingly. If you do this, you'll be blessed with a long life, and your study will be successful. Some say these afflictions are only if they don't prevent you from studying, some say only if they don't prevent you from prayer, some say both. This is all because, in some cases, physical suffering in this world could be to atone for your wrongdoings, and this is compared to salt, which is salty, but if placed on meat, actually just makes everything better overall. Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai says that the Torah, the land of Israel, and the world to come were all given to the Jewish people only through their suffering, so they could merit these. It's also said that if you learn lots of Torah, give lots of charity to the poor, and suffer by having to bury your sons, all your sins will be forgiven by God, based on some verses which relate to each other. Rabbi Yochanan says that specifically leprosy and suffering due to your children are not included in the above category, although it could be that leprosy is not a positive suffering only back in Israel, where they had it super rough and were banished and whatnot, unlike elsewhere, where it really wasn't a huge deal. As for suffering due to your children, this can't refer to them dying before you, as Rabbi Yochanan famously buried his 10th son and kept a small bone from the last one as a memorial to console him. Rather, it's referring to someone who doesn't have any children. On that note, there's a story that a Rabbi Chia bar Abba became very sick, and he told Rabbi Yochanan that he wanted neither this suffering nor whatever rewards it entailed, so Rabbi Yochanan took his hand and he immediately got better. The same thing happened to Rabbi Yochanan, with him giving up his own sickness and its reward. Also, he had to take the guy's hand, as the saying goes. A prisoner can't free himself from prison. There's another story where a Rabbi Elazar was very sick and was weeping, so Rabbi Yochanan, his teacher, went to visit him and told him that he had no reason to be sad over a lack of learning, wealth, or children, and Rabbi Elazar told him that he was sad that Rabbi Yochanan would one day decompose after he had passed, so they then cried about that together. Then Rabbi Yochanan took his hand, and he got better too, after saying he didn't want this suffering or its reward. Yet another story. Rabbi Huna had 400 barrels of wine that turned to vinegar, so he examined his actions to see what he had done to deserve this, and someone said that it could be because he doesn't give the agreed shares to one of his workers. But Rabbi Huna responded that he didn't because the guy kept stealing from him. But he was told that still it's pretty questionable, so he started paying the guy in full anyways, and some say that his vinegar turned back into wine, and some say that the price of vinegar rose and he was financially fine. Okay, back to prayer. Abba Binyamin said that he was always careful to say Shema in bed, and his bed faced north to south as the temple was to the east and west. It's said that if you do this respectful thing, you'll merit lots of blessings with children. Another teaching by this guy, if you enter a synagogue to pray with somebody and then leave while the other guy is still praying, distracting him, your prayer will be disregarded, and this causes the Shekhinah, the divine presence, to leave Israel. However, if you wait for your friend, then you get a lot of blessings. Another teaching from Abba Binyamin, which will bring us to a whole discussion about demons. Firstly, they're everywhere and invisible, thousands all around you, and cause you to feel crowded, tired, pained, and they wear your clothes out. If you want to check, spread ashes around your bed and check for chicken footprints in the ashes the next day. If you want to see them, take the placenta of a firstborn female black cat, which is the firstborn daughter of another female black cat, burn it, and then put the ashes in your eyes. Also seal the ashes in an iron tube so they can't steal them from you and harm you. One rabbi did this and got severely harmed, but the sages prayed on his behalf and he got better. That's that on demons. Now's a very long list of miscellaneous teachings relating to prayer and the synagogue that will take up, the next few pages, and in this, the next, 10 minutes or so. It's basically a bunch of loosely correlated quotes and teachings, so I'll go through them very quickly. Usually, each of these is a teaching along with a verse from the Torah as the source, but to save time, I'll say the teaching, and if you want to check the source quoted, well, just open the book. So, yeah, here we go. It's said that prayer is only heard in a synagogue based on some verses, similar to how we learn that the Shekhinah rests with 10 people praying together, with 3 who sit in judgment, with 2 who learn together, or even with 1 who learns by himself. But with 2 people, their words are written in the Book of Remembrance. We mention also that the Shekhinah rests by 3 people in judgment to establish that that's also considered learning Torah. We mention 10, because with 10 the Shekhinah gets there before they do. It's also taught that if you intend to do a mitzvah, but can't due to circumstances beyond your control, it's considered as if you did. Also, based on some other verses, it references that God wears tefillin, and tefillin gives strength to the Jewish people. It's taught that in God's tefillin, it says the verse, "Who is like your people, Israel, one nation in the land," and God is glorified through the glory of the Jewish people. The tefillin actually has 4 compartments, so the other 3 by God contain all of these verses listed over here. Now, this is way more than 4, so some of the verses are grouped up like this, and also every single verse is written on one long parchment for the arm tefillin, which has 1 compartment. Also, it said if you normally come to synagogue and miss a day, God asks where you were. If you had a mitzvah to take care of, though, it's fine. If God enters a synagogue and there's not 10 people praying there, he gets upset. Again, based on a verse. It's taught that if you set a fixed place for prayer, God will assist you, and when you pass, you should be eulogized as a humble and pious man like Avraham, who also had a fixed plan for prayer. Also, you should never run out of a synagogue, but you should always run into one, and should always rush to do such things. Also, some teach that the reward for attending a Torah lecture is from the rushing to do it, some for the crowding that occurs, some for the logical analysis. On this note, the reward for attending a house of mourning is for the silence. The reward for fasting is from the charity given on the day. The reward for a eulogy is from those that cry. And the reward for a wedding is from the good wishes granted. In addition, if you pray behind a synagogue, you're considered wicked, as it's like you're viewing them with contempt, assuming you turned away from the synagogue. Otherwise, it's fine. There's a story where somebody did this, praying behind the synagogue, so Eliyahu the prophet saw him, drew a sword, and killed him. In fact, in regards to this wickedness, it's also considered very not good to view mitzvahs or prayer with contempt, This is based on a verse which has the word kerum, which we're interpreting as vileness. Some say it means a type of bird which changes its color, and is reference to the embarrassment people feel when asking others for help, which apparently feels as bad as if you were punished with both fire and water, and makes your face change colors. It's also said to be very particular with the afternoon prayer, as Eliyahu the prophet's prayer over by the altar and the idolaters of Baal was answered by the afternoon prayer. By this, Eliyahu asked for God to answer him twice, once that fire should consume his offering, and the second so that the Israelites watching should believe that it was from God, but still be particular with the evening and morning prayer too. In regards to rejoicing at weddings, if you go and don't cause the groom to rejoice, you're in violation of a verse which speaks of 5 special voices right before the giving of the Torah, and if you do, you'll merit to acquire lots of Torah, and it's the same as if you had brought a Thanksgiving offering. One person says doing this is as great as rebuilding Jerusalem's ruins. Also says that if you have fear of heaven, your words are listened to, and it's as if the whole world was made just for you. Another teaching: if somebody wants to greet you, greet him first, and if he greets you and you ignore him, you're considered a robber. Also, we know God prays, because it says in a verse, the house of my prayer. What does God pray for? That his mercy should overcome his anger and all of his other attributes, and that he should go beyond the letter of the law for them. In fact, the Kohen Gadol, Rabbi Shema ben Elisha, said that on Yom Kippur, when he entered the innermost part of the temple to do the special Yom Kippur service, he saw an image of one of the names of God, who asked him to bless him, so he told him the above, and it was accepted. This teaches us to not take for granted even the blessings of an ordinary person. We can also learn to not try and placate somebody while they're in the middle of being angry, as God told Moshe after the whole golden calf incident to speak to him after he calmed down. This anger is daily, however, and it's for an incredibly short moment, specifically 158,888ths of an hour, once per day, or according to some, the length of time it takes to say the word rega. And no one's really figured out when this time is, besides for Balaam, and even then God decided to restrain his anger during that period, so Balaam's attempts at cursing the Jewish people had no effect. The general time period for this moment of anger apparently is somewhere within the first 3 hours of the day, when the sun whitens the crest of a rooster until it has no red streaks and it stands on one leg. So, whenever that is. In fact, there's a story about this one heretic who was annoying Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi, so he decided to wait until this exact moment to curse this guy, but he kept sleeping through the time period, so he took it as a sign not to. Apparently, the source for this anger is when the kings of the world worship idolatry. It's also taught that a moment of true remorse is better than a bunch of lashes. It's also taught that Moshe requested 3 things: that the Shekhinah dwell upon Israel, not on the other nations, and that the ways God runs the world be revealed to him. All of these were granted, and he was told that a righteous person who prospers is a righteous person, the son of a righteous person who suffers is a righteous person, the son of a wicked person who prospers is a wicked person, the son of a righteous person, and a wicked person who suffers is a wicked person, the son of a wicked person. There's some verses referenced, some which say that people aren't punished for their ancestors' deeds, some which say that they are, and it's explained that the difference is whether you continue down their path and do as they did. So, how could a righteous person suffer for his wicked ancestors? So, rather, it's that a righteous person who prospers is a totally righteous person who suffers is a not totally righteous person, a wicked person who prospers is a not totally wicked person, and a wicked person who suffers is a totally wicked person. According to others, however, the way God conducts the world was not revealed at all to Moshe, so you can just disregard all of that. In fact, now that we're talking about Moshe, it says that as Moshe turned away from God's face by the burning bush, he never merited to fully see it again. This disagrees with the opinion that Moshe was actually rewarded for that humility with a glowing countenance, with the people fearing him, and that he got to sort of see the likeness of God later on. Specifically, Moshe got to see the back of God's head, meaning the knot of the tefillin right above your neck. We also know that all of God's promises are always fulfilled, as God offered Moshe to destroy the Jews and make him a massive nation, and although Moshe refused, Moshe's descendants ended up being more than all of the Israelites during this period, over 600,000. It's also taught that Avraham was the first person to call God Lord, and even Daniel's prayers, way later, were answered in Avram's merit. Similarly, no one thanked God for creating the world until Leah did so by the birth of Yehuda, hence his name, which comes from the word meaning thanks. Her first son, Reuven, was named that as it's a mix of 2 words, Reu and Ben, which means sea and sun. How her firstborn son was unlike another firstborn son, Esav, that unlike him, Yosef, Reuven's brother, wound up with the firstborn rights, but Reuven wasn't upset about that, unlike Esav had been when the same thing occurred by him and Yaakov. On this note, Rus was named that because the word means to sate, which her descendant, David, did to God with his songs. In fact, based on another verse, it's established that your name can affect your life. Side point, the rabbi who taught this teaching also teaches that wayward children are as bad for your household as the war of Gog and Magog before Mashiach's coming. Back to King David, he opened the book of Tehillim by saying a psalm of David while fleeing from his son Absalom. Why does it say a psalm and not a lament of David like other ones? Answer is because David knew something unfortunate would happen to his dynasty due to the incident with Bathsheba, so he was kind of relieved when he found out what it was, and that it could have been way worse. This person, among others, teaches that you should provoke wicked people and not to be like them. Some say you actually should not provoke them, and the difference is established to be that you should leave them alone if it's with personal matters, but with matters of heaven, you should try to get them to do the right thing. Alternatively, it does refer to always, just leave them alone if they're doing successful, but if they're doing poorly in life, then you should advise them to do better. Or, even more alternatively, you should do this in literally all cases, but it should only be done if you're completely righteous. If you're not, don't, as if he gets mad at you, you won't be fully protected. He also taught that if you have a fixed point for prayer, your enemies that want to afflict and then destroy you will fall beneath you. He also says that physically following the Torah is more important than its study, as Elisha is quoted by being complimented with his deeds, not his study. There's a quick story about a Rabbi Nachman who was sick and unable to pray in synagogue, and he decided not to ask people to come pray with him in his home, so he was told to find out what time everyone else was praying and to do it privately at the same time. This is because the time when the congregation is davening is considered a time of favor, and there's a few opinions which verse this is sourced from, or if it's from a teaching which says that God says that if you do acts of kindness and pray alongside the congregation, you're considered as if you redeemed the Jewish people and God. In fact, it's said that if you have a synagogue in your city and don't go, you're considered to be a wicked neighbor and are punished that you and your children will go to exile. As for why during this period some sages chose to live in Babylonia during this time, they were fine because they spent pretty much all day in the synagogue, so we learn from this that you should go early and late to the synagogue. Also, if you enter a synagogue, go to doorway lengths in. It's mentioned you should pray in a time of finding, and this is explained to mean that you should pray when you want to find a wife. And it was a custom in Israel that when somebody got married, you would ask them if their wife was akin to the verse which speaks about your wife being good and wonderful, or bitter and worse than death. Alternatively, the time of finding refers to finding Torah, or to finding death in a peaceful manner. In fact, 903 types of death were created, the worst of which is croup, an exceptionally painful respiratory infection, and the easiest is the extremely painless kiss of death. Or, finding is a respectful burial, and said you should pray for mercy until the final shovelful of dirt is dumped on your grave. Alternatively, finding refers to a normal lavatory situation, which was less accessible in those days. It's taught that God loves the gates of study of Torah more than any other, and since the destruction of the temple, God is only within the 4 cubits of people studying Torah law. Based on this, many sages would only ever pray in the place where they studied. It's also said that if you benefit from your hard work, it's greater than somebody who has lots of fear in God but doesn't work. It's also said that you should live where your teacher lives because it'll prevent you from doing wrong, assuming you generally do what he says, otherwise it'll just lead to fights. Leaving the synagogue when the Torah scroll is taken out to be read is considered like you're forsaking God, and if you need to go out, just do so between readings. We're not really sure if you can leave in between the readings of the actual verses. One rabbi would actually just study as the Torah was being read, but others say you should read the Torah portion of the week also, actually, twice, and the translation of Onkelos once, which is the custom that many do to this day. Usually right as Shabbos is starting, and the reward for this is a long life. One rabbi tried to make up all the weeks he had missed of this on Erev Yom Kippur, but he was told that he shouldn't, and it should just be done along with the week. In fact, in regards to the day before Yom Kippur, having a large meal the day before to prepare for the coming fast is considered like doing the fast itself. Okay, some actually totally unrelated points here. Be careful when cutting the jugular veins when slaughtering an animal, and also be careful to respect an old man who forgot his Torah knowledge due to his old age, as it's comparable to both the unbroken and broken tablets that were stored within the ark. Then it says that the sage Rava taught his sons 3 pieces of advice. Don't cut meat while holding it, whether for the danger or it could ruin the food if you get cut. Don't sit on the bed of an Aramean woman, which is either a metaphor for not sleeping without saying Shema, or saying that it's preferable to marry a woman who was born Jewish, or perhaps it's literal, as there's a story that one time a Rav Papa was told by an Aramean woman to sit on her bed, and he refused, and then he found a dead baby there that he would have been accused of killing if he had sat down. His last teaching was to not pass by a synagogue while they're praying within, as it could be seen as disrespectful. The Rabbi Abaya says you can do this if there's multiple entrances because they'll just assume you're going in through the other entrance. The same applies if there's a different synagogue in the city or if you're carrying something heavy, running, or not wearing tefillin. Similarly, Rabbi Akiva taught 3 things he liked about the Medes: that they cut meat on a table and not on their hands, that they only kiss on the back of the hand, and that they hold counsel in private in the fields. Similarly, Rabban Gamliel says that there are 3 things he likes about the Persians: that they are modest in their eating, in the lavatory, and in intimacy. Okay, that was a lot, and just like that, we're finally going back to discussing Shema times. The last opinion was that of Rabban Gamliel, that you can say Shema until dawn. This is the opinion we follow. Technically speaking, you can actually say Shema twice, pretty much in a row by day, once right before dawn and once right after, and fulfill the evening and morning Shema obligations at once. Actually, right after dawn is still classified as night, but since people do get up then, and the obligation is to say it when you get up, it's permitted to say the morning Shema here. Again, this is the law. There's a very similar concept that you could say Shema twice in a row instead of before and after dawn. You can say it before and after sunrise, twice in a row during the day. Similar to the above, the time right before sunrise is still considered day, but it's referred to as night because some people do sleep then. So, this is also the law. However, if you are going to wait until right before sunrise to say the evening Shema, don't say the conjoining blessing of Hashkivenu, which is about going to sleep, as it's the middle of the morning. Some learn this ruling from this source, while some learn this based on an inference where there is a story where some sages got drunk at a wedding and woke up right after dawn, but before sunrise, and they were told they could still say the evening Shema, but only in emergency. Moving on, there was an incident mentioned way back at the beginning of the Mishnah where Rabban Gamliel's sons had gotten drunk at a wedding and their father told them that they could say Shema as it wasn't yet dawn. But why did they ask? Shouldn't they already know that? So it's explained that they just wanted to know whether the rabbis agreed with their father fundamentally, which they do, and they were just being stringent. Next, it was mentioned that this ruling of Rabban Gamliel, that whenever the rabbis rule something is until midnight, they actually mean until dawn, and this is in reference to a lot of sacrifices which have strict time limits. This actually doesn't include the Paschal sacrifice, although some disagree, and say you do have until dawn for this one. The argument is based on a verse which says in reference to the sacrifice until midnight, implying you have until midnight, but it also says it should be eaten in haste, referencing the Jewish people rushing out of Egypt, which was at dawn. Also, it clarifies other parts of the verse, things like it says on that night, night meaning not by day, unlike other sacrifices, and that night meaning only on that specific holiday night, and not across several days, although there is another opinion that says that you can eat it even until a second day. This entire argument actually happened at a different time, with their logic being based on different interpretations of verses. For instance, perhaps with haste actually means the Egyptians' haste to rush the Jews out, which was done at midnight. Also, in regards to the exodus from Egypt, there's some discussion about God telling the Jews to go and ask the Egyptians for a ton of gold as they left, which they got. Specifically, God actually said, please do this, because he had promised Avram that the Jews would be enslaved and then they would leave with riches, and he wanted to fulfill this promise, even though the Jews just kind of wanted to leave already. Some say it was the Jews who weren't that into it because it was going to be a long journey and they didn't want to carry all that stuff. Some say it was the Egyptians based on a verse, but either way, they totally emptied the place out. Also, by the burning bush, God said, I will be that I will be, which was God telling Moshe that the same way God was with the Jews by this exile, so too by all future exiles, but Moshe only told of this current exile to the Jewish people. Then it repeats that teaching about Eliyahu and Avi that was said a bit earlier, and that's the end of this section. Okay, next Mishnah. When do we start saying Shema in the morning? At the point in time where you can distinguish between the colors light blue and white. Rabbi Eliezer says between light blue and green. You have until sunrise, but Rabbi Yeshua says you have until 3 hours into the day, the time when kings get up. If you say Shema after this time, it's fine. It's just as if you read some Torah, so you won't get in trouble. And now, the Gemara on this portion. The whole blue and white differentiation refers to being able to tell the difference between blue and white tzitzis, as they're smaller, and you could easily tell the difference at any time by, say, a large pile of wool. Some teach that it's a time where it's bright enough that you can tell the difference between a wolf or a dog, some the difference between a donkey and a wild donkey, and some when you can recognize a friend from 4 cubits away, which is actually the opinion we hold, according to some. Although some say we should only follow them by the time we put on tefillin, and by saying Shema, we should be extra scrupulous and wake up extra early and finish saying the Shema by sunrise, which was done so that they could immediately start the day with the following blessing, which speaks of the redemption. And it's taught that if you do this, no harm will come to you during the entire day. Rabbi Zera said that he did this, and yet he was actually harmed during the day. But that wasn't any actual harm. He had to bring an honorary gift of myrtle branches to the king's palace, which he really had no interest in doing, so not actual harm. In fact, in regards to kings, you should always rush to be able to see the greatness of a king, even a not-Jewish one, if only to compare. And then speaks of the greatness of this one sage, Rav Beruna, who would rejoice in mitzvahs particularly by following this custom of waking up really early and saying the prayer of the redemption at sunrise. Also, there's some concern about there being an interruption between these prayers, because you open up this prayer with a little mini prayer in between where you ask God to help you to pray well. So some say you only do this by evening prayers, some only by the afternoon prayer, but consensus is that it's not considered an interruption, and it's just an extended part of the actual prayer, similar to the earlier mentioned prayer of Hashkivenu. Also, there's a similar blessing said at the end of this prayer, after the 18 blessings of the Shemona Esrei, as it's said after the first 18 Tehillim. Technically 19 Tehillim, but the first two are technically one chapter, so it's actually 18. In fact, originally, Tehillim had 103 chapters, but the remaining Hallelujah chapters were added after David saw the downfall of the wicked. Technically 104, but again, combine the first two. Chapters of Tehillim that David was particularly fond of begin and end with the word Ashrei, happy is. In fact, based on these Tehillim, there's a story about Rabbi Meir, where there were these neighborhood people who were driving him nuts, so he prayed for some of them to die, but his wife, quoting some Tehillim, said that it would be better to pray that they should repent, so he did that instead, and they repented. In fact, there's a different story about Rabbi Meir's wife, where a heretic decided to make fun of her for being barren based on some verses, but she educated him on the teaching of that verse, and it was somewhat resolved. In fact, people frequently get confused by certain verses. There was a question about why Tehillim opens with the one about Avshalom and then goes on to King Shaul, so that's kind of out of order. So it's explained that there's teachings that you can always learn by which verses are put next to each other. Specifically here, next to one which speaks of Gog and Magog, to show that the same way a son can rebel against his father, the world can rebel against God. In fact, King Shlomo praised his father, David, in his books for all this, and the 5 parts of his life, in the womb, birth, nursing child, fighting his enemies, and death. On this, it's taught, how is God unlike mortals? A mortal can carve the image of a person on a wall and it won't come to life, but God can give life to a fetus encased inside of another person. He's also different in the sense that he outlasts his creations. Alternatively, God and the soul are the ones that are represented by the 5 parts. That God and the soul fill the world and the body. They see, but are not seen. They sustain the world and the body. They are pure, and they both live in a chamber within a chamber. Also expresses how great God is, as he can effectuate compromise between righteous individuals, such as the story between Chizkiah and Yeshaya, by making one sick and having the other visit him, and tell him that he's not going to the world to come because he had no kids. So Chizkiah said it was because he foresaw that he would have wicked descendants, so therefore he didn't have any kids, and Yeshaya told him that that wasn't his call to make. So he asked if it was too late, and Yeshaya said, yeah, but Chizkiah said it's never too late. Even if there's literally a sword held over your neck, you should still pray to God for mercy. Similarly, it's taught that even if you're told in a dream you're going to die tomorrow, you should still pray for mercy, and it's never too late. Anyways, then Chizkiah prayed facing a wall to represent how he had made gold and silver walls for the temple, and prayed about how he had woken up early for Shema, or alternatively, that he had hidden the Book of Remedies, which contained how to heal any illness, so people would then rely on God. Apparently, the consensus was that was a good decision, along with him destroying the copper snake Moshe had made in the desert, and also not giving a proper funeral to his wicked father. But it was considered improper that he messed with the city's water tunnels, he gave the doors of the temple to Assyria, and he made changes to the calendar. Based on this prayer, it's taught that praying on behalf of your merit will have you judged off the merit of others, as Moshe did, and praying off of others' merits will have you judged according to your own actions, as occurred by Chizkiah. Since Chizkiah prayed based on his wall, now we're going to discuss another wall, the wall that Elisha stayed at by a poor woman's house. Specifically, that either they had an uncovered second story that they put a roof on for him, or that they had a porch, which they set up a partition based on your translation of the verse. They also gave him a bunch of amenities, and it's good conduct generally to either accept such things or, according to some, not to. By the whole event with Elisha, it was apparently the woman who noticed his holiness, as apparently women are more perceptive to their guests, specifically that either there were no flies or that he maintained his purity. His servant, on the other hand, was definitely not, and he tried to assault the woman. In regards to all of this, if you host a Torah scholar, you're credited as if you brought the Talmud sacrifice in the temple. And back to prayer. It's better to pray in a lower place, not standing on a chair or a stool with your feet pressed together, similar to how angels stand. You also should pray before you eat, as eating first is pretty arrogant. Okay, back to the point in the Mishnah. Rabbi Yeshua says you can say the morning Shema up until the 3rd hour of the day. This is the law we hold. We also say that if you pray after the time, it's no big deal, it's just as if you read some Torah, but this is excluding the prayer of Yotzer Or, as it's directly tied to the Shema. Some say you can say it, it's just the equivalent of reading some of the blessings, which is the opinion we hold like. In addition, if you say Shema past its deadline, you can still say it as blessings. Based on the fact that you're at a minimum considered just reading Torah, this would mean that saying Shema in its proper time is greater than learning Torah itself. And that's that. On to the next Mishnah. Beis Shammai says you need to literally be lying down when you say the evening Shema and standing up when you say the morning Shema. Beis Hillel says you can say it however you want. It's just that he uses those terms to tell you the times, and there's a third verse, when you walk along the way, which seems to imply that either or works. Rabbi Tarfon once was traveling, and he tried to lie down like Beis Shammai said, and he got robbed, apparently because he transgressed the statement of Beis Hillel. So now for the Gemara to explain this piece. Beis Hillel explains his logic and why he disagrees with Beis Shammai. Beis Shammai also said that he disagreed with Beis Hillel, but his logic is that of the literal explanation of the verses. You lie down by the evening Shema, because it says when you lie down, and the same for when you rise, that you must be actually standing by the morning Shema. As for his interpretation of the verse, and when you walk along the way, he explains that this means, as this is referring to doing something voluntary. If you're in the middle of doing a mitzvah, which is not voluntary, you're exempt from saying the Shema. Or a groom who is marrying a non-widow is also exempt, as you're more preoccupied there. This notion of being too preoccupied to say Shema really only applies there, as there it's a mitzvah, as opposed to, say, if you travel by sea, which is voluntary. So, in that case, you'll still need to say the Shema, even if you're preoccupied. This is similar to tefillin, which are only exempt by a mourner based on a particular word in the verses. As for traveling to do a mitzvah, Beis Shammai would say that this person is also exempt from saying Shema. Beis Hillel would agree, and points out that this is only if you're traveling for a mitzvah specifically. In fact, to further illustrate the difference of opinions in how you say the Shema, there's a brief story mentioned where a bunch of sages were gathered together saying the Shema. Some said it lying down, some stood up. Some did specifically the opposite of what others did to try to establish the law, etc. Also, apparently, you can hold like Beis Hillel or Beis Shammai according to your preference, although there's a story about their disagreement about the laws of Sukkah, where apparently some hold you have to hold like one, and some go so far as saying that if you hold like Beis Shammai, you're liable for the death penalty. But yeah, okay, now for yet another Mishnah. By the morning Shema, you say 2 blessings before and 1 after, and by the evening Shema, you say 2 blessings before and 2 after, whether you say the long or short version of the blessing. Although the general rule is that you can't shorten, extend, add, or subtract blessings that have been instituted. The Gemara asks, which blessing do we say before? Yotzer Or, and we don't change the verse, although it mentions darkness, which is a negative thing, because it's a quote from the Torah, and we don't swap it for a euphemism like we would normally do, as we want to mention the night by the date too, which we also do by night when we mention day and light in the prayer of Gala Or, which is said by night. The other blessing is that of Ahava Rabbah, which is unique in the fact that it actually exempts you from saying a different blessing over the Torah that you're meant to say before the Shema, because this blessing is very similar, so you could just say this one instead. And yes, there's a blessing you need to say before you study Torah, although not for Midrash. Some say you do need to say a blessing before studying Midrash, but not for Mishnah. Some say you do need to say a blessing before learning Mishnah, but not before Gemara. And some say even for Gemara you should say a blessing, based on the actions of Rav, who would wash his hands and say a blessing before teaching his classes. The actual blessing is that of La'asok b'divrei Torah, and some add that the Vaharavna prayer is said, and some add the Asher Bachar Banu prayer too. So it says to just say all of these, and we do this every day as a part of the earlier morning prayers. In fact, in a later tractate of the Gemara, it lists the order of the duties of the priests in the temple, and it mentions they start by saying a blessing, which is explained here that it's this blessing of Ahava Rabbah, or according to some, it's the blessing of Yotzer Or, based on the fact that elsewhere it says there are 2 blessings said here, and if you mess one of them up, it's okay, which only works out if it's the blessing of Yotzer Or. Now, This notion of messing up the blessings could actually mean saying them in the wrong order, as opposed to like missing one of them entirely based on whether or not this logic is based on an inference or not. A bit on the prayers said in the temple. They originally said the Ten Commandments, Shema, a bunch of other prayers, the Avodah, and the priestly blessings, but they cut out the Ten Commandments because the Tzaddiki's, a radical group of heretics who were causing a bunch of issues back then, and only believed in the written Torah and listened only to the Ten Commandments, so they didn't want to lend them any credence, so they just cut that part out everywhere. Anyways, there's also some blessings added by the priests on Shabbos. In regards to a different topic of the Mishnah about not adding or subtracting blessings, there are specific blessings said for each variant of food before eating, be it bread, wine, wheat-based foods, fruit, vegetables, or anything else. There's a specific blessing for each one of these. In the event that somebody has wine and starts saying the blessing for beer, but then switches at the last second, as the difference between the two of these is really only the last few words, it's fine. In fact, it's fine if you don't switch at all, as the blessing on beer is the miscellaneous food blessing, which technically could be used on any food. Alright, but what if the situation is reversed, meaning you have beer and you say the wine blessing and switch at the last second? Well, by the Shema blessings, if you mess up the first half and say the last part correctly, it's fine, so perhaps the rule is that as long as you conclude the blessing properly, it's alright? Well, not really, because the blessings of Shema are unique in that they are really long, so they could technically count as two separate blessings, in spite of the fact that these two wouldn't have God's name in it, unlike the food blessings, where such a concept doesn't exist, so you can't really compare the two. Fine. Although, actually, the rule of that as long as you conclude the blessing properly, it's alright, actually does exist. It's just learned from a source where a case is discussed that if you eat dates and say the blessing for bread and then get confused and think it's bread, so switch to the bread blessing and then realize that no, it actually is dates, so finish with the date blessing. In such a case, it's fine. Although, again, if you said the bread blessing on dates, it's still fine because the bread blessing speaks about giving sustenance, which dates also provide. Okay, now back to the argument as to which blessings you say on the Shema. Some say you must say Emes v'Yatzev by the morning and Emes v'Emunah by night. Also, when you say the prayers, you bow during certain words, whenever you say the word Baruch, and straighten up by God's name, based on some verses. Okay, some details on the Shemona Esrei, the Avodah, which is the prayer after the Shema and one of the main segments of prayer. One of the blessings is Melech Ohev Tzedakah Umishpat. Besides for the 10 days between Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, where that prayer is actually switched to HaMelech HaKadosh and HaMelech HaMishpat, although it's technically fine if you forget this change. New point. According to one rabbi, somebody who could pray on the behalf of somebody else and chooses not to is called a sinner. Another adds that if the person you're praying for is a Torah scholar, you need to make yourself sick with worry. This is based off of King David's worry and mourning over his enemies who are Torah scholars. An additional point is that if somebody fully is ashamed of a past sin, they are fully forgiven, even if it's alone and not with a community, as seen with King Shaul and his sin of killing all the residents of the city of Noiv. Okay, back to Shema. Originally, they wanted to institute Bilam's prayer as a part of the Shema prayer, but they decided not to because it was way too long, and it would be a bother for the congregation to say, and you can't just cut that part out from its lengthy context because Moshe didn't, and we don't either. We actually did have the verses speaking about tzitzis as a part of the Shema, as those speak about tzitzis, the exodus from Egypt, accepting the mitzvahs, admonition against heretics, admonition against improper thoughts, and admonition against idolatry, all learned out from this verse and its derivatives. Alright, last Mishnah of the chapter. We speak about the exodus from Egypt by the night Shema. Rabbi Eliezer ben Azariah said, I am like 70 years old, and I only learned this after Ben Zoma taught that it says in the verse to teach it, all the days of your life, which implies also nights. The rabbis say it's to imply also by Mashiach's coming. On the Gemara, it's explained that the rabbis hold that by Mashiach, that will be the thing spoken about in prayer instead of the Exodus. This is similar to how Yaakov's name existed but was replaced with his new name, his main name, Yisrael. This is also relevant to the verse, Behold, I will do new things, which is in reference to the wars prior to Mashiach's coming. In this regard, there's an analogy given of a man who is traveling and keeps getting attacked by new wild animals, each worse than the prior, to the extent where he's forgetting about each previous one and only focusing on the most recent one. So too with the issues of the Jewish people, that they get progressively worse to the point where you forget all about the previous ones. Also in regards to name changes, Avram's name became Avraham, to reference that he became the father of the world. Also his wife Sarai became Sarah, as she became the princess of the entire world. Also, you shouldn't ever mix up their names, but it's fine with Yaakov or Yisrael, as even he is referenced by both names later on, unlike the others. Although it does by Avram a little bit, but that's just because it's somebody referencing one event prior to his name change. And with that, that is the end of chapter 1. Thank you so much if you somehow got through this entire thing. Once again, for way more details, just read the original text. But yeah, I'll see if I can maybe make chapter 2 in the coming weeks, however long it takes me. But yeah, once again, thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed and found it informative. And with that said, have a great night.